I'm the groom's mother. Yet, on my own son's wedding day, my new daughter-in-law pointed to an isolated table right next to the catering staff and declared coldly, "Martha, you're sitting there." At first, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. While her family laughed and conversed at the VIP tables right up front, I was escorted to a seat near the kitchen doors, tucked away behind a massive decorative pillar that completely hid me from view. Humiliation burned hot in my chest, but I didn't argue. I just sat down quietly, because Brittany Collins had absolutely no idea that every single flower, every crystal chandelier, every gourmet plate, and every single second of this lavish wedding was paid for entirely by me. And before the night was over, everyone in that room was going to find out. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story strikes a chord with you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have walked out, or would you have stayed quiet like I did? Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with people from all over. My name is Martha Sinclair. In my life, I've never asked for much. No wealth, no luxury, and certainly no status. All I ever wanted was for my son to have a better life than I did. Looking back, I suppose that's the timeless dream of most mothers, especially those of us who had to raise our children alone. I live in a modest two-bedroom home in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but every single wall holds memories, some beautiful, some deeply painful. My husband, Daniel, and I moved into this house when we were young and full of hope. We dreamed of growing old here together. But fate had other plans. Daniel passed away from a sudden heart attack when he was only 43. On a completely ordinary Tuesday morning, he kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. By that evening, a police officer stood on my porch. I still remember the sound of the pouring rain that night, the grave look on the officer's face, and the precise moment my knees gave out beneath me. But most of all, I remember looking over at our 9-year-old son, Ethan. He was sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework, completely unaware that his entire world had just shattered. Mine had too. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. There were so many nights I cried myself to sleep after tucking Ethan into bed, and so many mornings I stared at the bills piled high on the kitchen table, wondering how on earth I was going to keep the lights on. I had no wealthy relatives, no hidden inheritance, and no safety net to catch us. All I had was sheer determination and a small sewing machine. For years, I worked as a seamstress before finally opening my own tiny shop. The sign outside simply read Sinclair Alterations. It wasn't fancy, but people trusted my craft. I hemmed wedding dresses, repaired uniforms, and tailored suits. Some days I worked 14 hours, sometimes even longer. I would drag my exhausted body home, my fingers throbbing and aching from sewing. Yet, every time I looked in on Ethan sleeping peacefully in his room, I reminded myself why I was pushing through. For him, every sacrifice, every missed vacation, every worn-out coat I wore for an extra winter, and every dream I set aside was entirely worth it. As Ethan grew older, he was more understanding than I ever could have hoped. At 16, he got a part-time job at a local grocery store. I never asked him to. He simply wanted to help ease the burden. I still remember the day he handed me $200 from his very first paycheck. "Mom," he said softly, "you've been carrying this family alone for too long." I cried all night, not because of the money, but because I knew I had raised a good, deeply grateful man, a son who would make his father immensely proud. Ethan worked tirelessly in school, earned a solid scholarship, and graduated college with honors. Eventually, he built a career as a civil engineer. The day he received his first major promotion, he drove 3 hours just to take me out for a celebratory dinner. That was Ethan, or at least that was who he had always been. He called me every Sunday, showed up for every birthday, and made sure I was never left alone on holidays. Friends often told me how lucky I was, and I knew they were right. For many years, Ethan wasn't just my son, he was my best friend. Which is precisely why I never imagined things would change so drastically. At least, not the way they did. The first subtle sign appeared one evening when Ethan called to say he wanted me to meet someone special. I could hear a distinct excitement in his voice, the kind of spark that only love can bring. "Mom," he said, "I met someone." I smiled into the receiver. "It's about time." He laughed, and then he spoke her name for the first time. Brittany Collins. At first, I was thrilled. Truly. For years, I had prayed Ethan would find a woman who loved him as deeply as I did. Someone kind, loyal, and ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with him through whatever life threw their way. A few weeks later, Ethan invited me to dinner so we could all connect. I remember spending an hour choosing what to wear. Not because I wanted to show off, but because I wanted Ethan's girlfriend to know she was important to me and that I had put effort into welcoming her. When I arrived at the restaurant, I spotted them immediately. Ethan stood up and waved, his smile lighting up the entire room. Sitting next to him was Brittany. She was stunning, elegant, and impeccably dressed, the kind of woman who looked as though she had just walked off a magazine cover. She greeted me warmly. Her smile was flawless, and her manners were immaculate, at least in those initial moments. The dinner itself progressed pleasantly enough. We talked about work, travel, family, and future aspirations. But every now and then, I caught small details. A fleeting glance, a calculated pause, or a tiny tightness at the corners of her smile. These were subtle micro-expressions most people would miss, but I picked up on them. Decades of working closely with tailoring clients had taught me how to read human behavior. There was something about Brittany that felt rehearsed, tightly controlled, as if every word she spoke had been pre-approved by a publicist. Still, I brushed those instincts aside, telling myself I was just being overly protective. After all, what mother doesn't worry a bit when another woman suddenly becomes the center of her son's world? Over the next year, Ethan talked about Brittany constantly, their weekend trips, their shared plans, their big dreams. Every time he mentioned her name, he sounded genuinely happy. For me, that was all that mattered. If it hadn't been for the quiet changes that slowly began creeping in, perhaps everything would have stayed fine. At first, the shifts were easy to excuse away. A missed Sunday phone call, a canceled dinner date, or a holiday visit cut short because Brittany had prior commitments. Nothing dramatic, nothing blatantly obvious, just minor drifts, like tiny hairline cracks in a foundation that you barely notice until the whole structure starts to tilt. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset all by myself. Ethan had canceled our weekly dinner for the third time that month. I had told him it was fine, and deep down I meant it. But after hanging up, I found myself staring at the empty chair across from me. It was the chair Daniel used to sit in, the same one Ethan occupied whenever he visited. For the first time in years, the house felt larger, colder, and distinctly emptier. I didn't know it then, but that quiet loneliness was only the beginning. Because soon, I would meet Brittany's family. And in that meeting, I would come to realize that the woman my son planned to marry carried values vastly different from my own, values that would ultimately lead to the most humiliating day of my life, where I was treated like second-class staff at my own son's wedding. The first time I met Brittany's parents, I understood exactly where she had inherited her cold, practiced smile. It was about 3 months after Ethan first introduced us. By then, their relationship had progressed rapidly. Serious enough for Ethan to discuss moving in together, and serious enough that I could already hear wedding bells echoing in the distance. One Sunday afternoon, Brittany invited me to her parents' estate for a family dinner. "It's going to be great, Mom," Ethan assured me over the phone. "My parents are really looking forward to meeting you," Brittany added. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the very first lie she ever told me. The Collins family lived in an exclusive gated community on the outskirts of Cincinnati. Just driving through the entrance gates made it abundantly clear that these people inhabited a completely different reality. Massive stone mansions, manicured lawns, and high-end luxury cars parked in pristine driveways. Everything looked like a meticulously staged photograph from an architecture catalog. I arrived carrying a fresh, homemade peach pie, using a cherished recipe my mother had taught me when I was a little girl. I remember standing at their front door holding that warm pie, feeling a flutter of nerves. not because I felt inferior, but because I sincerely wanted them to like me. The grand door opened. A tall, slender woman with perfectly styled blonde hair greeted me. Victoria Collins, Brittany's mother. Her smile was picture perfect, but her eyes remained icy cold. "Oh," she said. For a split second, a flash of disappointment flickered across her features. Then, the practiced smile snapped right back into place. "Martha, welcome." The tone in which she pronounced my name felt patronizing, polite on the surface, yet dripping with underlying condescension. I couldn't quite pinpoint it at that moment, but later, everything became crystal clear. The interior of the house resembled a high-end luxury showroom. Crystal chandeliers, gleaming marble floors, and extravagant fresh floral arrangements in every corner. Not a single object was out of alignment. I followed Victoria into a sprawling dining room where Richard Collins was waiting. Richard shook my hand warmly enough. Unlike his wife, he appeared quiet, almost submissive, the sort of man who had learned over decades that staying quiet made domestic life considerably smoother. Dinner began pleasantly enough, at least on the surface. Richard inquired about Ethan's engineering projects. Victoria discussed her involvement in local charity boards. Brittany talked enthusiastically about her marketing career. Everyone smiled, and everyone laughed on cue. But beneath the polished dinner table conversation, I could feel an uncomfortable dynamic at play. Constant evaluation, calculated observation, and quiet judgment. At one point, Victoria turned to me and asked how I spent my days. "I owned and ran a tailoring shop for many years," I explained simply. "Oh," there it was again. That precise little word, that subtle pause, that telling microexpression. "How interesting," she remarked. Interesting, not admirable, not impressive, but interesting. It was the exact tone people reserve for a quaint, minor hobby, not a business that had sustained a grieving family for decades. Still, I kept my composure, smiled, and said, "I truly loved the craft." Victoria took a slow sip of her wine. "I suppose working with your hands must be very fulfilling." Something about the way she delivered that comment stung. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the subtle classist framing. It was as if she were complimenting a hired gardener or a domestic worker, rather than a self-made businesswoman who had built an enterprise from the ground up. But I chose to let it slide. Then came the second moment I simply couldn't ignore. Brittany was showing everyone photos on her phone from a recent corporate retreat in New York. Spectacular hotels, high-end dining, and exclusive corporate events. When I remarked that the trip looked absolutely lovely, I meant it genuinely. Victoria looked over at her daughter and smiled warmly. "You've always belonged in that world, darling." Then her eyes shifted toward me. "You know, Brittany has always possessed very expensive taste." A ripple of polite, airy laughter went around the table. I forced a polite smile as well. Victoria continued. "Not everyone truly understands or appreciates authentic luxury the way Brittany does." For a brief second, the room fell dead silent. The remark hung heavy in the air like thick smoke, subtle, passive-aggressive, hard to explicitly call out, yet impossible to ignore. Ethan appeared completely oblivious to the dig. Richard stared down intently at his plate, and Brittany said nothing to soften it. And that's when a harsh realization hit me. People often reveal their true character not just by what they choose to say, but by what they quietly allow others to say in their presence. The remainder of the evening dragged on with more polished stories, more wine, and forced laughter. But I noticed a distinct pattern. Whenever I brought up practical, grounded topics, Victoria skillfully redirected the conversation. Whenever Brittany spoke of high status or material success, Victoria beamed with pride. Everything in that household revolved around surface appearances, social clout, and how things looked to outsiders. Driving home alone that night, I felt completely drained emotionally. I kept playing the entire evening back in my mind. Was I being overly sensitive? Was I misinterpreting their tone? Maybe they were just accustomed to a different lifestyle. For Ethan's sake, I desperately wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. But over the following months, that unsettling pattern only intensified. The subtle digs became more frequent, sharper, and increasingly difficult to ignore. One afternoon, Brittany accompanied me on a shopping trip. Ethan had asked her to help me select a dress for an upcoming engineering awards gala where he was being honored. I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for us to bond. Instead, it turned into another glaring warning sign. I picked up a structured navy blue dress, simple, elegant, and modestly priced. Brittany barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "Oh, definitely not." I offered a gentle smile. "What's wrong with it?" She let out a dry laugh. "You wouldn't want to show up wearing something so modest." Modest? There was that patronizing tone again. I slowly placed the dress back on the rack. She immediately pointed toward a high-end designer piece hanging on a featured display. The price tag read nearly $600. I practically gasped. "Brittany, that single dress costs more than my entire monthly grocery budget used to be when Ethan was growing up." She laughed. She actually laughed out loud. And then she uttered a phrase I will never forget. "Well, perhaps that's why you've never experienced real fashion." The words felt like a physical slap across the face. She said it with a sweet smile, as if it were nothing more than a harmless, playful joke. I stared at her, waiting for the realization to register, waiting for a quick apology. But none came. Instead, she casually drifted toward another rack as if she hadn't just insulted my life's struggle. I came very close to calling Ethan that night. Almost. But I held back because I already knew how he would rationalize it. "Mom, she didn't mean it like that. Asterisk, or you're misinterpreting her. Or she was just poking fun." I refused to put my son in an impossible middle position, so once again I chose to suffer in silence. Months flew by, and their relationship moved at full speed. Before long, they were engaged. The grand proposal took place during a lavish weekend trip to Napa Valley. Within minutes of Brittany posting the polished ring photos online, Ethan called me, his voice practically trembling with joy. "Mom," she said yes. I remember forcing my voice to sound thrilled, and deep down, a genuine part of me really was happy for his joy. Ethan deserved to be loved, to build a family, and to find happiness. But another part of me felt a knot of dread in my stomach. Not just because of Brittany herself, but because of everything she prioritized. The obsession with status, the fixation on wealth, and the habit of measuring a human being's worth strictly by the size of their bank account. A few days later, I attended the lavish engagement party hosted by the Collins family. And that was the night I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the core. I was stepping out toward the patio for some fresh air and happened to overhear Victoria talking to one of her close friends. Neither of them knew I was standing near the arched entryway. "Brittany did extraordinarily well for herself," Victoria remarked smoothly. Her friend nodded in agreement. Victoria lowered her tone slightly, though her words remained sharp. "Let's just say Ethan is incredibly fortunate to be marrying into a family like ours." The women chuckled together, and my stomach turned over. Fortunate? As if my son were a charity case who had won a golden ticket. As if he weren't an accomplished, highly educated, kind, and hardworking man who had built his own success. As if the Collins family were somehow bestowing a favor by allowing him into their orbit. In that exact moment, the full truth crystallized. Victoria didn't just look down on me, she looked down on our entire family lineage. And tragically, Brittany had adopted far more of her mother's elitist mindset than I had wanted to admit. Still, seeing how radiant Ethan looked, I swallowed my pride. I kept quiet, I smiled for photos, I attended the dinners, and I played my designated role, desperately trying to convince myself that love would conquer all of it. But I had no idea that the real nightmare hadn't even begun. Soon, the wedding preparations would officially launch, bringing with them a web of secrets regarding money, pride, and vanity that would alter everything forever. A week after the engagement party, Ethan showed up at my house looking completely worn out. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was that heavy, soul-deep weariness that settles into a person's eyes when they are carrying a crushing weight they don't know how to share. I recognized it the moment he stepped across the threshold. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" I asked, setting down my tea. He forced a weak smile. Of course, Mom, everything's great. I raised an eyebrow at him. A mother always knows when her child is putting up a front. My reaction managed to draw a brief, dry chuckle from him. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and he sank into the chair at the kitchen table. For several long minutes, neither of us said a word. Then he let out a heavy, ragged sigh, and I knew the truth was about to surface. What's going on, Ethan? He rubbed his temples aggressively. It's the wedding planning. I wasn't surprised. Weddings have an unfortunate way of transforming joyful celebrations into pressure cookers. What about it? He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably before the words finally burst out. The budget! It just keeps climbing out of control. I frowned softly. By how much? His laugh was laced with bitterness. Trust me, Mom, you don't want to know. Actually, I think I do. I waited patiently. Finally, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents, spreadsheets, vendor estimates, and itemized contracts. When my eyes landed on the bottom line numbers, I nearly choked on my coffee. The venue rental fee alone exceeded the entire purchase price of my home. The proposed floral arrangements cost as much as a brand new sedan. And the catering estimate. I had to double-check the commas to ensure I was reading the digits correctly. Ethan, I breathed out. He nodded in quiet defeat. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then I asked the most crucial question. Why is it costing this much? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Brittany has a very specific vision. She wants something truly special. Special. I had heard that word thrown around enough to know it usually preceded spending money people didn't actually possess. And her parents, I trailed off. Another telling, uncomfortable silence followed. That silence handed me every answer I needed. A few days later, I uncovered even more of the dynamic. Not because I was digging around, but because Brittany insisted I attend a high-level wedding planning meeting, one of many sessions that would make me regret ever sitting at that table. The consultation took place in a private suite at a luxury downtown hotel. The high-end wedding planner, Lauren Bennett, sat across from us. Unlike the others, Lauren was remarkably professional, organized, and genuinely kind. Victoria Collins immediately commandeered the entire room. We absolutely must have the upgraded floral archways, Victoria asserted with authority. Lauren made a note, of course, and the full perimeter architectural lighting package. Understood. And naturally, the imported hand-cut crystal table centerpieces. Lauren's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. Every single addition seemed to tack on thousands of dollars to the running total. Yet I picked up on a subtle glitch in the room. Every time Lauren brought up deposit due dates or payment structures, Victoria's enthusiastic posture faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to spot it. Finally, Lauren asked a straightforward business question. When should we plan to finalize the primary financial accounts for these installments? Instantly, the atmosphere in the room turned thick and awkward. Victoria looked over at Richard. Richard stared down at his watch. Brittany turned her head toward Ethan. Nobody offered an answer. Lauren maintained her professional smile. Whenever you're ready to proceed. The meeting eventually wrapped up, but I couldn't shake that moment of dead silence. Something was profoundly wrong with this picture. Later that same evening, Ethan called me, his voice sounding entirely strained once again. Mom, can I ask you an honest question? Anything, Ethan. If someone genuinely loves you, would they expect you to take out massive loans just to fund a single day? The question broke my heart because I knew he wasn't asking a hypothetical scenario for a friend. He was agonizing over his own life. I took a slow, deep breath. No, Ethan, they wouldn't. Silence filled the line. Then he confessed softly, I'm already filling out personal loan applications. My heart sank into my chest. Ethan. I don't know what else to do, Mom. I want to give her the dream, but I'm drowning. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I knew how meticulously he had worked to build his financial stability. I knew how disciplined he had always been with his savings, and how desperately he wanted to enter marriage on firm financial ground. And now, he was contemplating drowning himself in soul-crushing debt before even walking down the aisle. Over the next 48 hours, I couldn't rest. The situation felt completely unnatural. Then, by pure accident, the full reality came to light. It happened when Lauren Bennett called my personal cell one afternoon, operating under a misunderstanding about who handled what, completely unaware of the bombshell she was dropping. "I'm trying to reach the financial point person for the Collins family," Lauren explained apologetically. "We have an urgent issue regarding the secondary venue deposit clearing." I asked a few calm, carefully framed questions, and the information she provided left me stunned. The Collins family was not wealthy at all. It was an illusion. They lived comfortably, certainly, but nowhere near the elite status they projected. The luxurious lifestyle Victoria bragged about was built almost entirely on mountains of credit card debt, home equity loans, and an exhausting rat race to keep up appearances. This grand wedding wasn't about celebrating the love between Ethan and Brittany. It was a glorified PR event designed to impress their social circle. In an instant, every piece of the puzzle locked into place. The obsession with luxury labels, the constant demand for expensive upgrades, the subtle put-downs toward my background, and the desperate need to feel superior. Victoria wasn't planning a celebration of marriage. She was staging an extravagant theater production. The tragic part was that my hardworking son was being coerced into footing the entire bill. That night, I sat alone in my dark living room. In this modest house, I had spent decades carefully managing every dollar I earned. I thought back on the endless sacrifices, the grueling 14-hour days at my alteration shop, and the smart, quiet investments I had consistently made over 30 years. Most people assumed I was barely scraping by because I chose to live simply. I never bothered to correct them. My self-worth didn't depend on external validation. What none of them realized was that decades of disciplined saving and smart investing can accumulate into a quiet fortune. I wasn't a billionaire, but I was exceptionally comfortable. After selling my commercial shop and property a few years prior, my portfolio held substantial retirement accounts, stocks, and cash reserves. More than enough to live out my life in complete security, and more than enough to step in when my son truly needed a lifeline. The very next morning, I called Ethan. "Come over to the house." An hour later, he was sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where he used to do his elementary school homework. I calmly placed a thick manila folder in front of him. "What's this, Mom?" "Open it." He opened the folder, and as his eyes scanned the balance statements, he froze. The color drained from his face. "Mom, what is this?" Inside was official proof of liquid funds I was transferring to cover the entire wedding cost, in full. He went pale, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to push the folder back across the table. "No, absolutely not. I can't take your life savings." I offered a soft, reassuring smile. "You sound just like your father." "Mom, I'm serious, I can't accept this." I reached across the table and firmly clasped his trembling hands in mine. "Yes, you can, Ethan." Tears welling in his eyes, he choked out, "Mom, this is way too much." "No," I said, squeezing his hands tightly. "You are my son. Everything I ever worked for was to ensure your security and happiness." His voice cracked completely. "You've already given up so much for me." I shook my head gently. "I am your mother, Ethan. I get to decide when I've done enough." For several emotional minutes, we sat in profound silence. Finally, he looked at me through tears and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, thank you." Those 3 words carried 30 years of unconditional love, trust, and mutual devotion. Then I looked him in the eye and delivered one strict, non-negotiable condition. "No one can know about this." He blinked, utterly confused. "What, why?" "No announcements, no special mentions during speeches, and absolutely no public credit given to me." "Mom, why would you want to hide something this generous?" "Because by that point, I had fully diagnosed the character of Victoria and Brittany Collins. I didn't want performative gratitude or fake affection. I wanted to observe exactly how they would treat me when they truly believed I had zero financial value to offer them. I simply prefer to keep my private business private, I told him. It wasn't the entire truth, but it was enough to satisfy him. A few days later, Ethan officially introduced me to Lauren Bennett as the sole financial backer for the event. All agreements were finalized quietly, legally, and professionally behind closed doors. No fanfare, no public declarations, just as I insisted. Exactly 3 people on Earth knew who was funding the extravaganza: Lauren, Ethan, and myself. I genuinely believed it was a simple act of maternal love, a silent gift to protect my son's financial future. I had no concept that this exact secrecy would grant Brittany the ultimate weapon to humiliate me. Because once my money began flowing freely into the vendor accounts, an unexpected transformation occurred. Instead of expressing relief, Brittany became insatiably demanding. And slowly, deliberately, I began to be erased from my own son's wedding, step by calculated step. For a brief, naive period after signing those financial transfers, I tried to convince myself that conditions would improve. I assumed the immense stress would dissipate, and that Brittany would grow more relaxed, appreciative, and perhaps even kinder toward me. I couldn't have been more wrong. The exact opposite unfolded. As the wedding budget swelled to staggering heights, my physical presence within the planning process shrank to practically nothing. At first, the exclusion was executed through subtle slights. A key vendor meeting scheduled without notifying me, a major daycare selection finalized without my input, or a final venue walkthrough where my invitation somehow got lost in transmission. On their own, each instance could be rationalized away. After all, I kept reminding myself that it was their special day, not mine. But as the weeks ticked down, the systematic isolation became undeniable. One afternoon, Lauren Bennett called my phone, her tone practically vibrating with stress. "Martha, I'm calling to double-check the authorization on the secondary floral upgrade." I paused, holding my coffee cup midair. "What floral upgrade, Lauren?" A long, uncomfortable silence hung on the line. "The ultra-premium orchid package, the one Brittany signed off on yesterday afternoon." I turned toward the window, looking out into my quiet backyard. "How much is it?" When Lauren quoted the figure, I nearly dropped my mug. The cost of that single asterisk upgrade exceeded the price of the first reliable car I had bought Ethan, all spent on exotic stems that would rot in a dumpster 48 hours later. I closed my eyes and took a quiet breath. "Authorization approved, Lauren." Lauren hesitated, her voice dropping. "Martha, are you absolutely sure about this?" I knew she wasn't just asking about the banking logistics. She was asking if I was truly okay with being treated as an invisible ATM, if I realized how blatantly I was being exploited. But I defaulted to my protective script. "It's fine. Let them have their perfect day." The following week, it was an upgraded entertainment package, followed by imported artisan welcome baskets for the hotel guests, and then custom-crafted hand-blown glassware. Every time I assumed we had reached the ceiling of extravagance, Brittany identified a new method to burn through capital. What stunned me most was her utter lack of anxiety over the costs. She never hesitated, never compromised, and never displayed a moment of financial restraint. It made my stomach churn. People who have actually labored for their money develop a fundamental respect for its value. Those who have sacrificed for every cent protect it fiercely. But Brittany treated hundreds of thousands of dollars like Monopoly paper, abstract numbers on a screen rather than the literal sweat and sore fingers of a woman who had spent decades behind a sewing machine. One evening, I forced myself to attend another design showcase. By that point, I dreaded every single one of them. The presentation took place in a high-end design showroom. Brittany was standing near an elaborate mock table display draped in liquid silk and crystal accents, with Victoria standing proudly beside her like a queen regent. Lauren was diligently recording notes. I arrived 10 minutes early, but my entry went completely unacknowledged. Brittany was fully absorbed in debating table linens. Apparently, there were dozens of critical shades of white that demanded intense scrutiny. I quietly took a seat in the back corner. After nearly 15 minutes of listening to them debate napkin folds, Brittany finally glanced in my direction. Oh, just a single, flat word. Oh! No warm greeting, no welcoming smile, just an acknowledgement of an inconvenience. In an instant, I felt like an unwelcome intruder at an event funded entirely by my life savings. Lauren, ever the professional, made a point to greet me warmly. "Martha, I'm so glad you could join us tonight." Brittany didn't even look up from her swatch book. "We've basically finalized all the major aesthetic decisions already." I maintained a polite mask. "That's perfectly fine." In my head, a voice screamed, "Then why did you ask me to drive an hour to be here?" But I swallowed the bite and remained silent. The session dragged on. At one point, I tentatively offered a gentle suggestion. What if we set up a modest heritage photo table near the reception entrance? We could display framed vintage photos from both families, grandparents, parents, childhood memories. It brings such a personal, heartfelt touch to a venue. Brittany immediately shook her head with total finality. "No, absolutely not." The sheer coldness and speed of her refusal caught me completely off guard. Victoria chimed in instantly. "I completely agree with Brittany. It's a non-starter." I blinked, stunned by the united front. "Oh." Brittany adjusted her swatches dismissively. "It completely clashes with the luxury aesthetic we've curated. It would look cluttered." Aesthetic, apparently honoring family heritage and deceased fathers, was classified as clutter that ruined the photo ops. I felt deeply foolish for having opened my mouth. Lauren shot me a look of profound sympathy, but remained silent. What could she say? The bride had delivered her verdict. A week later, another incident sliced even deeper. I was at the venue assisting Ethan with organizing final logistics. He looked terribly exhausted. Managing the wedding on top of his engineering workload had turned into a grueling second job. When he stepped into a private hallway to field an urgent work call, I found myself standing near a cluster of Brittany's bridesmaids who had no idea I was within earshot behind a decorative partition. One of her friends asked casually, "So, spill the tea. Who is actually funding this entire royal wedding? This setup must be running 6 figures easily." I froze, holding my breath. Brittany let out a light, breezy laugh. "Oh, my parents are handling the heavy lifting, obviously." Victoria smiled with supreme satisfaction. Another friend chimed in, nodding in admiration. "Honestly, that makes total sense. Everything is top tier. At least you guys don't have to rely on Ethan's side of the family for anything." Then came the cruel snicker from the group, followed by Brittany's silence. She didn't correct them. She didn't say, "Actually, Ethan's mother is being unbelievably generous. Asterisk or Martha made this entire dream possible." She said absolutely nothing to defend my dignity. She simply stood there, soaking in the false praise, smiling her pristine, hollow smile. That silent endorsement spoke louder than any insult ever could. I quietly slipped out through a side exit before anyone spotted me. That night, I sat alone in my dark living room. The television was humming softly, but my eyes were fixed on the wall. I kept replaying Brittany's calculated silence. Sometimes, what a person refuses to say reveals everything you ever need to know about their character. I wasn't bitter because the guests were ignorant of the truth. That had been my deliberate request. What broke my heart was watching a young woman eagerly claim credit for sacrifices she never made, actively allowing others to view my family as destitute parasites, reinforcing Victoria's twisted belief that we were lesser human beings simply because we didn't parade superficial wealth. The sheer irony was suffocating. Without my silent sacrifice, this grand fairy tale wedding would have collapsed into financial ruin before it even started. Yet, as the date drew near, I was being steadily erased from the narrative. As the wedding day approached, the subtle dismissals escalated into outright disrespect. Then came the issue of the reception seating chart. At the time, I had no clue just how calculated and humiliating that arrangement was designed to be. Lauren was reviewing table assignments with the couple, family tables, dignitaries, corporate colleagues. I happened to glance at the master board and noticed a strange omission. My name wasn't listed anywhere on the primary layout. I assumed it was a simple oversight that hadn't been printed yet. No reason to cause a scene, I told myself, but a lingering sense of unease settled in my chest. Everyone else had a designated place of honor, while my position remained a blank ghost. I considered asking Lauren about it privately, but I talked myself out of it, a hesitation I would deeply regret. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan paid a surprise visit to my house. He looked genuinely happy, happier than I had seen him in months. For a fleeting afternoon, the old Ethan returned, the sweet, attentive boy who used to sit on the porch with me. We spent hours talking about his upcoming engineering projects, old memories, and life, deliberately steering clear of wedding stress. Before leaving, he wrapped his arms around me in a tight hug and whispered, "Mom, thank you so much." "For what, sweetheart?" "For everything, for always being my rock." The raw sincerity in his eyes nearly brought me to tears, because I realized the heartbreaking truth. Ethan was completely blind to the manipulation happening right under his nose. He didn't see the cruel exclusions, the calculated put-downs, or the intentional disrespect. He was simply an exhausted groom trying to keep his bride happy, build a future, and trust the woman he loved. A powerful urge surged within me to lay it all out, every subtle insult, every passive-aggressive comment, every painful moment of exclusion. The truth was right on the tip of my tongue. But then I visualized his reaction, total heartbreak, explosive confrontations, and a chaotic war days before his wedding. I couldn't do that to my son. I refused to ruin his joy. So I swallowed the poison, forced a loving smile, and hugged him back tight. I had no idea that behind my back, decisions had already been finalized regarding my place at that wedding. Decisions Ethan knew nothing about, designed explicitly to humiliate me in front of hundreds of elevated guests. The definitive warning sign came just 3 days later, through a phone call from Lauren Bennett that changed the trajectory of everything. 10 days before the wedding ceremony, the phone rang. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon, and I was in the bedroom folding laundry. The caller ID displayed Lauren Bennett's name. I assumed she was calling to double-check a routine transaction authorization. By that point, those financial check-ins had become standard procedure. I answered warmly, "Hello, Lauren." There was an unnatural, heavy silence on the line. "Hello, Martha." Instantly, my stomach dropped. Over the preceding months, I had developed a deep respect for Lauren's professional demeanor. She was always sharp, decisive, and confident. But right now, her voice was trembling, laden with obvious hesitation and guilt. I placed the folded towel down. "Lauren, is everything all right with the venue?" A slow, heavy sigh came through the speaker. "Martha, I am stepping way outside my professional boundaries by making this call. If anyone finds out I spoke to you about this, my agency's reputation is on the line." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "What is it? Please tell me." Lauren took a steadying breath. "It's about the final reception seating arrangement and the official family protocol document." "Martha, I'm stepping way outside my professional boundaries by making this call. If anyone finds out I spoke to you about this, my agency's reputation is on the line." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "What is it, Lauren? Please tell me the truth." Lauren took a slow, steadying breath on the other end of the line. "It's about the final reception seating arrangement and the official protocol document. Brittany and her mother just finalized the floor plan this morning. Martha, they moved your table." "Moved it," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Moved it where?" "To table 24, Lauren said, her tone heavy with disgust. "It's located at the very back of the grand ballroom, right next to the double doors leading into the main kitchen. There's a massive structural concrete pillar blocking that entire section. From where you'll be sitting, you won't even be able to see the bridal table, the dance floor, or the cake cutting. You won't see your son." A cold numbness began spreading from my chest, straight down to my fingertips. "Table 24, I murmured, trying to process the sheer malice of it. "And who else is sitting at table 24? "That's the worst part," Lauren confessed, her voice shaking slightly with outrage. "It's designated as the overflow table for the vendor staff, off-duty catering crew, and late additions. Martha, they put the mother of the groom at the kitchen door with the hired help. Meanwhile, Victoria's extended social club and distant acquaintances are sitting at the head tables right in front of the stage." I stood frozen in my quiet laundry room, the rain beating rhythmically against the window pane. "Does Ethan know about this layout?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. "No," Lauren replied firmly. "Ethan was told that all family members were assigned to VIP Zone A near the front stage. Brittany submitted the finalized chart directly to the venue coordinator behind his back after he left for a site inspection this morning. When I tried to gently remind Brittany that you were the one funding the entire event, she looked me dead in the eye and said, 'Martha prefers to stay out of the spotlight anyway. She'll feel much more comfortable back there away from our elite guests.'" Lauren paused, letting out a sharp, frustrated breath. "Martha, I've been coordinating high-end weddings for 12 years, and I have never seen a family treated with such calculated cruelty. You paid over $200,000 for this wedding. You saved this entire event from collapsing into total financial bankruptcy. If you want me to halt the vendor payments right now, or if you want me to force a seat change, I will do it. Just say the word." For a long, agonizing moment, I closed my eyes. Tears prickled at the corners, but I refused to let them fall. The sheer disrespect, the arrogance, the deliberate attempt to hide me away like a dirty secret, it burned through my veins like fire. They thought I was just a quiet, helpless old seamstress from Columbus who could be pushed into the dark shadows without a peep. They thought my silence was weakness. "No, Lauren," I said softly, my voice suddenly steadying into something like cold steel. "Do not halt the payments. Leave the seating chart exactly as Brittany printed it." Lauren sounded completely bewildered. "Martha, are you sure? You're going to let them humiliate you like that on your own son's biggest day?" "I am going to attend my son's wedding," I replied, a slow, resolute calm washing over me. "And I am going to sit precisely where the bride wants me to sit. But I want you to do one small thing for me, Lauren." "Anything," Lauren said immediately. "I need you to ensure that the itemized vendor settlement envelopes, the ones containing the final official balance receipts and signed proof of payment, are delivered directly to the main head table right before the formal toasts begin." A heavy, knowing silence fell over the line. Then I heard Lauren catch her breath. "Consider it done, Martha," she whispered softly. "Consider it done." The day of the wedding arrived with a crisp, cloudless sky. The venue was an estate venue outside Cincinnati, a sprawling historic mansion featuring stone arches, lush gardens, and a grand ballroom outfitted with soaring vaulted ceilings. I wore a tailored dusty rose silk dress that I had hand-sewn myself over 3 long nights. It wasn't flashy, and it certainly didn't sport a designer price tag, but the stitching was immaculate, the cut was timeless, and it fit me perfectly. I pinned a small, delicate silver brooch, a gift from Daniel on our 5th anniversary, right above my heart. When I arrived at the estate's chapel for the ceremony, the air was thick with the scent of thousands of imported roses. The sheer scale of the setup was breathtaking. High society guests lined the pews, dripping in diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and designer gowns, whispering admiringly about the sheer extravagance of the event. Victoria Collins floated through the crowd like a queen regnant, beaming with absolute pride as she accepted lavish compliments from her wealthy acquaintances. "Oh, thank you, darling," I overheard Victoria gushing to a local judge's wife. "We simply insisted on giving Brittany the royal treatment she deserves. Nothing less than perfection for our daughter." I took a quiet seat near the middle pews for the ceremony. I didn't cause a scene. I just sat quietly and watched as my son, my sweet, brilliant Ethan, stood at the altar in his dark tuxedo, looking handsomer than his father ever had. When Brittany walked down the aisle in her sweeping designer gown, framed by the elaborate floral arches I had paid for, Ethan's eyes filled with tears of pure devotion. My heart ached for him. He loved her with every fiber of his soul, completely unaware of the rotten foundation upon which this fairy tale was built. The ceremony was flawless. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and the applause echoed through the stone chapel as they were declared husband and wife. Ethan looked radiantly happy. Then came the reception. As the guests transitioned into the magnificent grand ballroom, the full scale of the setup came alive. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling, golden light over dozens of round tables adorned with hand-blown glassware, gold-trimmed dinnerware, and towering orchid displays. I followed the flow of guests toward the reception entrance, where the seating board was displayed. As I approached, Brittany and Victoria were standing nearby, greeting prominent guests and directing them toward the front VIP tables. When Brittany caught sight of me, her smile tightened slightly, taking on that familiar, artificial edge. "Martha," she said, stepping forward to intercept me before I could walk deeper into the room. She pointed toward the far back corner of the ballroom, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. "You're sitting over there, table 24. Her tone was utterly flat, completely stripped of any warmth or affection. I looked down the long line of elegant tables, past the glittering dance floor and the raised bridal head table, all the way to the dark, shadowy corner she was pointing to. There, tucked almost completely behind a massive, square concrete pillar, sat table 24. It was draped in plain white linen, lacking the gold trim and elaborate orchid arrangements featured on every other table. 2 catering staff members in black aprons were currently leaning against the wall right beside it, polishing silverware. "Table 24, I asked calmly, looking directly into her eyes. "Yes," Brittany replied, not a single trace of shame or hesitation in her voice. "We had to prioritize high-profile guests, corporate contacts, and my family up front near the stage. The front area is quite crowded, and frankly, I knew you'd feel far more comfortable out of the main spotlight. It's much quieter back there." Victoria stepped up beside her daughter, smoothing the lapel of her designer dress, her cold eyes scanning me with blatant triumph. "Yes, Martha, it's really for the best. We wouldn't want you feeling out of place among our inner circle." The sheer arrogance of those 2 women stood exposed right before me. They had used my hard-earned money to build a monument to their own vanity, and then banished me to the garbage corner so I wouldn't ruin their pristine, high-society image. A fiery rage surged inside me, but I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. "I understand perfectly, Brittany," I said, offering a serene, quiet smile. "Table 24 it is." I walked slowly down the entire length of that glittering ballroom. I walked past table 1, where Victoria's affluent socialite friends were clinking champagne glasses. I walked past the corporate executives, the local politicians, and the polished young influencers. I walked all the way to the back, stepped past the swinging kitchen doors, and took my seat at table 24. From my position, the massive concrete pillar blocked 90% of the main room. I couldn't see the head table. I couldn't see the main stage. The ambient noise of clattering dishware and sizzling pans echoed clearly from behind the kitchen doors every time the catering staff pushed through. A young server named James, looking deeply uncomfortable, walked over to me. "Ma'am, are you sure you're supposed to be back here? Isn't this the staff breakout table?" "I am right where the bride wanted me to be, son," I said gently, patting the chair beside me. "Please, sit down if you're taking a break." For the next hour, I sat quietly at table 24. I ate my dinner in the shadow of that pillar while the rest of the room celebrated. Ethan was so swamped with handshakes, photos, and greetings at the front of the room that he had no idea where I had been placed. Every time he looked around for me, the massive pillar hid me completely from his view. Then the clock struck 8:30 p.m. The grand banquet was concluding, and the DJ's voice boomed over the high-end sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the main head table for the official welcome, family toasts, and the presentation of the evening." The entire ballroom fell quiet. Guests turned their chairs toward the raised stage where Ethan, Brittany, Victoria, and Richard were standing, champagne flutes in hand. Right on cue, Lauren Bennett stepped out from the side corridor holding a thick, elegant leather portfolio containing the final, official financial settlement documentation. As per my exact instructions, she walked straight up to the head table, right past the microphone, and placed the open portfolio directly in front of Ethan and Richard Collins. Victoria frowned, leaning over her daughter's shoulder. "Lauren, what is this? We are in the middle of formal toasts." "I apologize for the interruption, Mrs. Collins," Lauren said, her voice amplification picking up through the stage microphone just enough for the front half of the room to hear clearly. "As the lead wedding coordinator, I am legally required to present the finalized, fully settled account summary and vendor receipts to the primary party before the official reception program concludes." Ethan picked up the leather folder, looking thoroughly confused. "Wait, finalized accounts? What do you mean?" "Every single vendor invoice for this evening. The venue hire, the floral design, the imported crystal, the gourmet catering, and the entertainment packages has been paid in full," Lauren announced smoothly. Victoria's face immediately brightened with smug satisfaction. She grabbed the microphone from the stand, tapping it gently to gain the entire room's attention. "Thank you, Lauren," Victoria declared into the microphone, her voice echoing gloriously across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. Today has been an absolute dream come true for our family. As Brittany's mother, I want to formally say that providing this level of unprecedented luxury and elegance for our daughter and her new husband has been our family's greatest joy. When you love your child, no expense is too great." The crowd broke into enthusiastic applause. Victoria beamed, soaking in the admiration, practically glowing with social triumph. Brittany smiled radiantly beside her, raising her glass to the cheering room. Ethan, however, was staring down at the itemized ledger inside the portfolio. His brows furrowed sharply. "Wait," Ethan's voice cut through the applause, sharp and bewildered. "Lauren, who signed off on these wire transfers, these account numbers. This isn't the Collins Family Trust account." Victoria dismissed him with a light wave of her hand. "Ethan, darling, don't worry about the technical details right now." "No, hold on," Ethan interrupted, his voice growing louder, echoing straight through the PA system as he turned a page in the document. "This wire transfer confirmation, it's from an account held at Columbus First National. The primary account holder is Martha Sinclair." The room went dead silent. The applause abruptly ceased. Victoria froze. Her smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. That must be a clerical error." "It is not an error," Lauren stated clearly into her lapel mic, her voice projecting with absolute authority into every corner of the grand ballroom. "Every single dollar of this $240,000 wedding was funded exclusively by Martha Sinclair. Mrs. Sinclair transferred the liquid capital from her personal investment accounts 3 months ago to ensure that her son's wedding could proceed without incurring debt." Gasps rippled across the room like a wave. Brittany's jaw dropped in absolute horror. Richard Collins went pale as a sheet, staring blankly at his wife. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his head snapping up as he looked wildly around the room. "Where is my mother, Mom?" Ethan scanned the VIP front tables. Empty. He scanned the middle rows. Nothing. "Where is she?" Ethan demanded, his voice cracking with rising anger as he turned to Brittany. "Brittany, where is my mother sitting?" Brittany stammered, her face turning bright red, completely unable to utter a single word. Ethan shoved the microphone into Richard's hands and practically ran off the stage. He marched down the center aisle, searching every single table. The guests watched in breathless, stunned silence as the groom sprinted past the high society tables, past the middle section, all the way down to the very back of the room. He rounded the massive concrete pillar and stopped dead in his tracks. There I sat, quietly sipping my tea at table 24, right beside the swinging kitchen doors, surrounded by empty staff chairs. Ethan stared at me, then looked at the plain table, then looked at the kitchen doors, and finally looked back at the grand stage 100 feet away. The realization of what had been done hit him like a physical blow. The color completely drained from his face, replaced instantly by a look of pure, unbridled rage and profound heartache. "Mom," Ethan choked out, his voice trembling as he stepped toward me. "What? What are you doing back here? Why are you sitting at the kitchen table?" I set my teacup down gently on the saucer and looked up at my son. "Brittany told me I'd be more comfortable back here, Ethan," I said, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly audible to the quieted room nearby. "She felt I didn't fit the aesthetic of the front tables." "What?" Ethan roared. He turned around sharply, his face flushed with deep fury, and marched right back down the aisle toward the stage. The entire room of 200 high society guests watched in absolute awe. Ethan stormed up to the head table, grabbed the microphone directly out of Richard's hand, and turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan's voice boomed through the speakers, sharp, trembling with emotion, and utterly furious. "I want to make something crystal clear to everyone in this room tonight." Brittany reached out to touch his arm, tears springing to her eyes. "Ethan, please don't do this." "Do not touch me," Ethan snapped, pulling his arm away forcefully. He looked directly out at the sea of wealthy guests, politicians, and socialites. "My mother, Martha Sinclair, raised me completely alone after my father died when I was 9 years old," Ethan declared into the microphone, his voice ringing with powerful pride. "She worked 14-hour days behind a sewing machine until her fingers bled so that I could go to college. She sacrificed her entire life for me." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Victoria looked like she was about to faint, holding onto the head table for support. "And when this wedding was about to be canceled because the budget spiraled out of control," Ethan continued, glaring coldly at Victoria and Brittany, "it was my mother, and only my mother, who quietly stepped up and paid over $200,000 out of her own life savings so we could have this day. She didn't ask for praise. She didn't ask for a speech. She asked for nothing." Ethan paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, his eyes burning into Brittany. "And in return for her sacrifice, my new wife and her family put my mother at table 24, in the dark, behind a concrete pillar, right next to the kitchen doors, so she wouldn't ruin their aesthetic." A collective, horrified gasp erupted from the guests. Several women in the front row covered their mouths in disbelief. Whispers instantly exploded across the ballroom like wildfire. Victoria Collins looked like she wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow her whole. Brittany was openly sobbing, her face buried in her hands as the judgment of 200 people crashed down upon her. Ethan set the microphone down on the stand with a heavy thud. He walked off the stage, past his crying bride, past his utterly humiliated mother-in-law, and walked all the way back to table 24. He reached out his hand to me, his eyes full of love and deep apology. "Mom," Ethan said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "please, let's get out of here." I looked at my son, saw the boy I had raised so proudly, and took his hand. I stood up, smoothed down my hand-sewn dusty rose dress, and walked out of that grand ballroom arm-in-arm with my son, leaving the Collins family to stand alone in the middle of the expensive, glittering mess they had built on lies. That night, Ethan didn't go back to the bridal suite at the luxury hotel. He drove straight to my modest 2-bedroom home in the suburbs of Columbus. We sat at the old kitchen table, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and talked until the sun came up, just like we used to. 2 weeks later, Ethan officially filed for an annulment. Brittany and her mother tried desperately to contact him, to apologize, to save face, but Ethan refused to answer a single call. The humiliation the Collins family suffered within their wealthy social circle was absolute. Word of what they had done spread like wildfire, exposing their fake wealth and cruel pretenses to everyone they had ever tried to impress. As for me, I am back in my cozy home in Columbus. The house isn't grand, and it certainly isn't fancy. But every single wall is filled with real love, true sacrifice, and authentic respect. And no amount of money in the world can ever buy that.